Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to share with you some tips regarding moving to Dubai. So for anyone who's interested in going there, I will share a few things with you that you might not otherwise know or might not otherwise hear. They're a little bit of quirks, and yeah, maybe they will be useful for you given this is a very popular place to move at the moment. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you'd like any help with relocating abroad, figuring out the best place to go get a residency, permanent citizenship, etc., please reach out to us. You can book a call, county.com/Michael-Rosmer, link in the description below. Or go to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so let's start with right when you arrive, okay? So when you arrive, you conceivably are probably going to want to get a UAE SIM card, be able to have a cell phone there. Now, here's the messed up thing, sort of, in UAE, is they separate out SIMs for locals or cell plans for locals from ones from foreigners. Turns out the foreigner ones are better. So, you can, to the extent that you can, start with like one for tourists, keep it going, that's great, but at some point you're probably going to want to convert it over to a local SIM. And let's just talk about this quickly, because there's some nuances where UAE works really well if you operate within their box, and it works much less well if you don't operate within their box, okay? So, for example, there is a bunch of cases where if you don't have a UAE cell phone number set up with, say, WhatsApp, it's going to create some issues, because what they will try to do is they will try to correlate everything to your cell phone number. For example, if you need to get a delivery, such as from the bank will have your UAE cell number on file, and they'll be able to, deal with the tracking process, reschedule your delivery, et cetera, all from within WhatsApp. It's super great. But if you don't have WhatsApp set up with your new phone number, your UAE phone number, then that's going to cause problems. So first of all, right when you arrive, they'll often offer you a tourist SIM. It's 1 gig, but it's only for 1 day, so make sure you get one for longer. And yeah, if you can, I would recommend getting a tourist SIM, keep it going for as long as possible, and then flip it over into postpaid. Now, when you go to do postpaid, it's certainly helpful if you can do that once you've got set up with you'll need your Emirates ID and all that. But ideally, you can do it with a real credit card. Now, let's talk about this quickly. So there's some bizarre things with paying bills in UAE. Again, if you operate within the system, things work well. If not, not necessarily. So first of all, there is a bunch of cases, if you're just walking around, if you're paying for taxis, going out for dinner, etc., a foreign credit card is going to be fine. However, when you start to deal with some of these local things, sometimes it, say, won't allow you to use a foreign credit card to pay through, say, the online app. Very annoying, but it is what it is. So it's better to have a card. Now, you might think, oh, I have a Visa. I'm used to thinking in terms of that being a credit card. Now, that works for most cases, but then there will be situations like, for example, the two cell providers in UAE are Etisalat and Du. If you go and sign up with Etisalat, they might say, we're giving you 20 gigs per month of free bonus data. All right, sounds like a good deal, right? But that's only assuming that you have auto pay turned on. So you think, okay, no problems, I'm going to pay anyway, so I'll just turn on auto pay. Not so fast. You can't turn on auto pay without an actual credit card, okay? I'll come to banking in a second, but what this means is that ideally, when you open a bank account, you set yourself up with an actual UAE credit card. So again, I'll talk about that in a second, but this will give you the most flexibility. So the card that you get, the initial SIM, you can flip that over into a SIM that is postpaid, so you can keep the same number. So that's good, all right? That's a good thing. There's sometimes little quirks that are kind of annoying, like, for example, you'll want to be in a situation where maybe you have family members and you want to put them under the same plan. Well, often you run into weird limitations like, oh, you can't sign up for the same person can't sign up for plans multiple times in a day. So you have to do, so there's some like little quirks that are a little bit annoying in that regard. You can do it when you're doing the postpaid or the prepaid. that's fine. The tourist sim, etc., go and sign up for a few people, etc. When you flip them over, I certainly ran into an issue with this. So be aware of that. So that's the first thing. The next thing comes to banking, okay? So to get banking, and we're gonna kind of go down the rabbit hole because there's related pieces here, you're typically going to need an address, okay? Now, the address is gonna come in one of two forms normally. The one is you've got a hotel that is able to provide you on their letterhead some sort of a letter that states that that you're living there. And this is quite common. So long as you stay at a hotel typically for longer than 10 days, then they will do that. And as a result, one of the things you probably don't want to do, even though there's some reasons why it might seem appealing, is to be bouncing from one place to another when you arrive. When you're first getting set up, it's much better to book in at one place for more than 10 days so you can get them to give you this letter so that you can turn around and bring it to the bank if you go that way, all right? Now, you don't necessarily have to go that way. In fact, ideally, the much better way to go is you can get something called an EJARI. What is an EJARI? In UAE, you don't just get a rental agreement. The rental agreement doesn't really count for that much, probably because they've had lots of people come from all over the world and try to scam the system. They've built kind of a unified system. And so an EJARI is the government recognized rental contract, or could also be ownership record. So supposedly it's registered on the blockchain, and basically when you rent or buy a place, this should be registered and they should get you this EJARI, okay? That EJARI is something that the banks and everybody will trust. So EJARI, very good thing, important to get an EJARI, all right? And there's a bunch of cases where maybe you are renting a room from somebody, or I don't know, whatever, an Airbnb, you won't have an EJARI, right? This is just not part of the process. So very important. Also worth noting that if you are renting, you cannot have multiple people on the same EJARI. So very annoying, but it is what it is. So only one person on the EJARI if you're renting a place, even though maybe you're splitting rent with your friend, or you have a spouse or whatever, this is the case. So you're gonna get an EJARI, or you're going to get this document from the hotel. You're going to bring it to the bank. You're also going to require proof of kind of your source of income, which is either going to be your work contract, or if you're an investor visa, then details of the investment or company. When you provide that, they will typically be able to open an account for you. Sometimes, depending on the bank, they may want more or less deposit. It's usually a pretty straightforward process. There's lots of banks. That part I wouldn't be so concerned about. Although if you have come and started up a company too late, in other words, that you left it for a while and you didn't have a bank account, then let's say you come 6 months later, they're going to say, well, show us the history of the company so we can see how much money the company is making, which reflects on your income. And this depends on the bank. Some of them won't do this, but that's a bit of an issue. So it's best to do it as soon as possible. As soon as possible, I would plan on, when you come to UAE, the initial time and you get everything set up, take the time to open the bank account when you're there, personal bank account we're talking about. It will take a few days for them to send you a card. Once you have the card, you can access your online banking, everything's good. You can't start the process, open it, leave, and then just come back 9 months later or 6 months later or 3 months later or whatever. They're going to avoid that initial account opening, so be wary of that, okay? So plan on staying, once you apply for the bank account, within, I would say 3 days would be pretty normal, but let's just say a week to be safe. Great, you've got that. Now, to get a card, if you have some sort of a work contract, then usually based on that work contract, they can issue you actual credit. The way that credit works in UAE is typically each bank has kind of their own record of it. It's not a really unified system quite the same way as you have in Canada or the US, etc. But there is some concept of tracking credit, and it's good to start building that credit. To do that, if you're in a situation where you don't have, say, a work contract that they're willing to give you some sort of a loan based on, you would put up a deposit. And they'll usually give you any particular card based on that. Now, this is a good thing, by the way, because it turns out they've actually got pretty decent points cards in UAE. The downside is that all of the cards are denominated in dirhams, okay, the local currency. Okay, it's pegged to the US dollar, but you're gonna have a conversion rate. The two banks that have cards that are not in dirhams travelers cards are First Abu Dhabi Bank and Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Okay, so those two have a traveler card. It's one of their higher tier cards. It also has rewards, so it's not quite as good as their top rewards cards or the top rewards cards from some of the other banks, but still pretty decent. And so worth considering if you're going to be doing a lot of your spending outside of the country. If you're doing your spending inside the country, I mean, you're going to convert at whatever rate anyway, and then you can just spend in dirhams. But yeah, fairly good cards, worth investigating which one fits for you. There's a lot with like Emirates Skyward Miles, there's some with Marriott Bonvoy, there's a bunch of others that you can get. And on top of that, some of them you'll get discounts at restaurants as well, sometimes some pretty good discounts at restaurants actually, depending on where you're going. So keep that in mind. But you can secure that card. You can say, okay, I'm going to put up 100,000 dirhams, and that becomes my credit limit on the card. And then you can get pretty much whatever card. This is worth it because of the fact that A, you get points, and B, you're in a situation where you can activate some of these other things that are a little bit more tricky to deal with, such as the auto pay on Etisalat. Okay. Now, so that's banking, relatively straightforward. Just kind of for the record, probably First Abu Dhabi Bank, Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. These guys would probably be the tougher banks to open accounts in. Emirates NDB tends to be a little bit easier. Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank, a little bit easier. Those are kind of the top 4 local banks. Then you have the foreign banks, which is like Standard Chartered, HSBC, Citi, etc. All options. In my analysis, generally speaking, I would say I find I'm more interested in the local banks, but you can take at it as you would like. And then there's a bunch of kind of lower tier local banks. Emirates Islamic Bank, RAK Bank, Mashreq, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of them. So it gives you a little bit of an idea, depending on what your situation is and what you would prefer. You can basically go into Dubai Mall, and there's, most of them are located there. So in particular on the bottom floor, they have a whole section of banks. Some of them are in other places, but that would be a good starting point if a person just wants to go to one place and bounce between banks and check them out. You can also, of course, check out their websites. What is next? Let's talk about getting around. So Dubai is incredibly convenient. I have a good friend who recently bought a vehicle, and he was like, I don't know why I'm buying this vehicle. I don't need it. Uber's fantastic. They just show up. When you drive, you have to worry about parking. Then often you have to pay for parking. I don't know why you need it. So in a lot of cases, I think this is true. Generally speaking, if you're just getting around within the city, then no problems. You probably don't need a car. It's probably not even worth it to you. On the other hand, if you want to be driving to Abu Dhabi, to Ras Al Khaimah, to into the desert, etc., or if you just want to go touring neighborhoods, it's much nicer to have a car. Now, maybe what you decide is that you can just rent a car for the little bits that you want to do that. Okay, fine. Public transit is not that good in the sense that it just doesn't reach that many places. So although the metro, or whatever the heck they call it, is pretty good when you get on it, it's not got a lot of coverage area. So I would say a person probably doesn't want to rely on public transit in UAE. They're probably going to rely on either taxis / Uber, or they're going to go and look at getting a vehicle. Vehicles are quite fairly priced. You're also in a situation where gas is super cheap. So in that sense, if you're worried about costs, no real issues there, and you can get a plethora of vehicles. It is worth noting that if you're buying a vehicle, you should make sure you get something called GCC spec. So this is essentially vehicles that are specially set up to run in the Middle East, because if they aren't, if you had a vehicle imported from Canada, for example, the heat and dust is not really so great, and this will affect your resale value. It will also possibly affect, how the kind of maintenance that you have on the vehicle and the problems that it's likely to have. So GCC spec, very important. Lots of options in terms of vehicles. Insurance, relatively inexpensive. Vehicles, relatively inexpensive. Gas, super inexpensive. So those things are all good. If you're talking about getting around with not owning a vehicle, then there's Uber, and Uber's great. Super convenient, high quality. Usually they pull up with Lexuses and things like this, just based on normal Uber. This being said, if you want to save money, taxis are typically dramatically cheaper. So be aware of that. If you download the Careem app, Careem is like local Uber, which was then bought by Uber. You can get actual taxis through that app as well as other cars, and you will generally save some money. There's also some different bonuses there. In addition to this, you can get food delivery and honestly, you can get delivery of everything in UAE. This being said, you can pay a monthly fee and get unlimited delivery, which is pretty awesome. There's Deliveroo, there's Talabat, there's Careem, etc. A bunch of these offer various different delivery, and they have 24-hour delivery of various different food options, which is great. So yeah, those are all fairly helpful. So that's cell phones, that is vehicles, that is banking, that is leases. Be aware on leases that you're typically going to have two things that are a little bit annoying. The first is often they want you to pay a year in advance. Very abnormal for a lot of the rest of the world. The second is when you do this, if you don't pay a year in advance, they're going to want checks. And by this they mean physical checks. So you really need to have a bank account before you get a place. So this is this kind of catch-22 you end up in, where they say, hey, we want checks, but you can't have checks until you have a bank account, and a lot of the banks want an address. So this is why I was mentioning when you first come, if you need to, stay in a hotel. Don't stay in an Airbnb, stay in a hotel. Just pay the little bit of extra money or whatever, and stay there for 10 days so that you can get a proper address. Based on getting the proper address, you can get a bank account. Once you have the bank account, you can get a checkbook. Once you have the checkbook, you can then go and you can pay based on whatever. I find that a lot of places are pretty negotiable. So whether it's 3 checks, 4 checks, 6 checks, some are 12 checks. Basically that means how many times per year, and you'll fill out those in advance and you'll give it to them, and then they'll deposit it at whatever period of time. So that's another thing that is a little different. Other than this, it's usually really easy to send money electronically within UAE from the apps. Emirates NDB probably has the worst of the big 4 apps. And so, you can keep that in mind, but realistically, there's options depending on what you prefer. You can get multi-currency accounts in most of these banks, or rather not multi-currency accounts, but you can get accounts in multiple currencies. So if you want to add US dollars, etc., usually it's super easy. You just go on the app, add account, and off you go. Quite straightforward. So that's great. Then we can look at a few other things, such as there's something called chiller free, which is included in some of them. This basically means that you're not paying for the air conditioning, and air conditioning is obviously a cost that goes throughout the year. So be aware. You'd have something called DIWA and Empower are probably the 2 big utility providers, although there's a couple others. And so you'd have to account for those in your bills. Sometimes, as I said, if you have chiller free, then you don't have to pay for it. So that's great. You can get cleaning services, super easy. There's apps for that. Order something. A lot of the buildings include something like that. Almost every building has a pool. Almost every building has some kind of a gym, although depending on whether it's up to your standard or not is personal to you. And yeah, that gives a few kind of the things that I think are, just little things, right? It doesn't make that big a difference, but if you run into them and you don't know how to deal with it or you're not expecting it, then it can be a bit of an issue. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and I will look forward to seeing you guys on the next video. Also, let me know if you have any comments, little things that you observed when you relocated to UAE, and other people can benefit from those. We will talk to you soon.